Induced traffic is a phenomenon in which new or expanded roads and highways that are promoted as an answer to traffic congestion fill up quickly because they encourage more driving to happen. With the new road space, people take more trips, switch trips from other modes to driving, and become less careful about avoiding rush hour. They also might be encouraged to move further away from their job and accept a commute with more driving. Exactly how fast the new road space fills up depends on lots of factors. Very congested roads, when widened, fill up especially fast. Induced traffic is why road congestion is a constant problem that cities, especially growing ones, never seem able to beat. For more detail, check out the excellent paper from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute linked in the description, or our video on the topic, which we'll link here.
In the comments to that video, some people asked whether the same concept can apply to housing. If building new road space doesn't necessarily help congestion, maybe building more housing doesn't necessarily help affordability either. This is an interesting idea, and it's good to see people thinking more deeply about induced traffic. There are actually some intuitive reasons why someone might think this. Easily the two most expensive cities in Canada, Toronto and Vancouver, are known for the pace at which they're building new residential high-rise towers. Vancouver gives its name to Vancouverism, an urban planning philosophy built around dense urban living, and Toronto at one point had more cranes in the air than any other city in North America. It's easy to see all the housing supply dominating the skylines in these cities and wonder whether all of this building really leaves the city better off. Does increased housing supply actually help with affordability?
Spoiler alert, it actually really does help. Building more housing brings more people to live in a city, but it also seems to have a real moderating effect on housing prices. We mentioned that Toronto and Vancouver have a lot of housing construction, but that's only partly true. These cities have a lot of really visible high-rise tower clusters that stand out in the skyline, but that doesn't mean they're building enough or as much as they could. Both cities have large swaths of land where most housing development is prohibited, not just towers but also mid-rise apartments and even low-rise multiplexes like you have in Montreal. With the goal of creating stable neighborhoods and other cute euphemisms, Toronto limits almost 2/3 of residential land to detached or semi-detached homes, and Vancouver has similar policies. It's not even just that we're failing to house more people. Many older neighborhoods of Toronto and Vancouver actually saw depopulation as households became smaller, and not enough new housing units were constructed to maintain the previous population. The area west of the University of Toronto, where we've lived, lost around 30% of its population between 1971 and 2016, and it's not because there's any shortage of people wanting to live there.
Canada's Federal Housing Authority released a big study in 2018 on why Toronto and Vancouver are so expensive. Among other factors, they found that the supply of housing in those two cities is less elastic, or responsive to demand, than in the three other cities they looked at: Montreal, Calgary, and Edmonton. Normally when prices rise, you expect builders to respond by building more. But when this doesn't happen, like in Toronto and Vancouver, prices keep rising. What's worse, rising prices make more people jump into the market to buy. Both investors looking for an asset that's going to keep going up in price, and regular people with major FOMO who might not need to buy right now but who don't want to be priced out later. The result, as anyone who lives in Toronto and Vancouver can tell you, is that prices spiral out of control. To be clear, zoning and community opposition aren't the only restrictions on supply in these cities. They also have a limited supply of land because of water, and in the case of Vancouver, mountains. But having a limited supply of land makes it even more important to allow more dense housing configurations.
There's actually a lot of evidence that zoning and other government supply restrictions make housing less affordable, especially in places with high demand that would otherwise have high levels of housing construction. When housing supply is highly regulated in a certain metropolitan area, housing prices are higher and population growth is smaller. An influential 2003 paper in Urban Economics introduced a neat analysis of construction costs and sale prices to find that the price to buy an apartment in Manhattan more than doubles because of supply restrictions like height limits, difficulty getting permits, and community opposition. More recently, researchers did a similar analysis in Australia and found that zoning raised the price of detached homes by 73% and apartments by 85% in Sydney, with smaller but still important effects in Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. The zoning effect here is in purple. Very similar results have also been found in New Zealand, with regulation doubling the price of a house in Auckland and having a smaller but still important effect elsewhere.
Those findings were all at the large scale, usually the metropolitan area level. Many people are also concerned with the local level, where they worry that new housing supply doesn't help or even makes affordability worse in the surrounding neighborhood. They worry about gentrification, that new market rate housing in less affluent neighborhoods might bring an influx of middle to higher income households, the people usually targeted by new housing. And they're followed by new restaurants and shops and other amenities, which further attracts more middle to high income people, and the original lower income residents get priced out. Before we get into that, it's important to keep in mind that making housing easier to build does not just allow development in lower income neighborhoods. It also allows development in higher income neighborhoods, maybe even more so, because those are usually the ones with the strictest zoning and the most ability to stop development with political influence. Allowing more varied housing in wealthier neighborhoods makes them more accessible to a wider range of incomes, and it's easy to see how that's good for affordability and social cohesion. But let's focus on lower income neighborhoods. Does new housing there have this local gentrification effect? A research review from UCLA shows that 5 of 6 recent studies suggest no. New housing does to some extent attract more people in these neighborhoods and increase amenities, which might on its own raise rents, but that effect is more than cancelled out by the positive effect of adding new supply. New housing, even if it's targeted at middle to high incomes, takes pressure off older and lower end housing, freeing units up for lower income people. And it's important to point out when thinking about gentrification that banning new housing doesn't necessarily stop higher income people from coming into a neighborhood, but it does make them compete with existing residents for the same older houses. One of the studies also finds that new market rate housing in San Francisco reduced the chance of nearby renters and rent-controlled apartments getting evicted. When rents rise fast because new units aren't getting built, landlords have more incentive to evict people who are protected by rent control. The research review concludes that new market rate housing improves affordability at both the metro area and neighborhood level.
So why does housing supply matter for housing affordability? When you think about it, that's not weird. That's what you expect. Whether something is abundant or scarce usually matters a lot for its affordability, whether we're talking about housing or food or most other things. From this perspective, the weird case is roads, because congestion seems to be surprisingly unaffected by how much road space is built. So what's so special about roads? As we explained in our other video on induced traffic, the challenge isn't roads so much as cars. Public transit and cycling don't have the same seemingly constant problem with congestion, at least when given a comparable amount of space, because they take up so much less space per person. A 2-lane road mainly used by cars is a low-capacity corridor prone to congestion, while the same space dedicated to bikes, buses, or trains can have free-flowing traffic at much higher capacities. The lesson we should learn from induced traffic and car congestion is not that it's impossible for the supply of roads to keep up with demand, but rather that it's really hard to accommodate cars specifically, especially in large or growing cities, and especially when we make road access free. Free things are a lot more prone to running out of supply. We could actually manage induced traffic and avoid congested roads with congestion pricing. The same applies to parking. The book The High Cost of Free Parking goes into detail, oh my god, so much detail, on how parking being free can make it much harder to find a spot.
There are lots of differences between driving and housing, which people will surely talk about in the comments. But one big reason it's easier for the supply of housing to keep up with demand is that it's much more practical to build up for housing. A 10-story residence is practical and economical to build, but a 10-level road is an absurd idea for about a dozen different reasons. So we're left with 1 or occasionally 2-story roads that get congested easily, at least when they're mainly used by cars. If you look at Toronto, for example, there just isn't room to substantially increase the supply of roads, but there is plenty of room to substantially increase the supply of housing. Some people have the perception that Toronto is full, but the city could almost double its population if the suburban boroughs like Scarborough and Etobicoke even had the population density of Old Toronto. And Old Toronto isn't even consistently that dense. With the population density of Brooklyn, the city could triple its current population. Toronto has reached its capacity for cars, but not for people.
To recap the video so far, it's easy to look at really expensive real estate markets like Toronto or Vancouver, see all the housing dominating their skylines, and wonder whether housing construction really helps affordability. But these cities aren't actually doing a very good job of building housing, beyond the super visible towers in certain locations that you can see from far away. Toronto and Vancouver have housing markets that are overall more regulated and less responsive to demand than other Canadian cities. And there's a bunch of research, including from the US, Australia, and New Zealand, that supply restrictions, from zoning to community opposition to uncertain approval timelines and other related obstacles, meaningfully and even drastically harm housing affordability. As for whether induced demand applies to housing like it applies to car traffic, it does apply in the sense that building more housing can draw people into a neighborhood or city, but it's a lot easier for the supply of housing to keep up with demand than for the supply of roads to keep up with demand. Among other reasons, this is because housing can be built more densely when needed, whether that's a 5-story mid-rise or a 20-story high-rise, and because roads being free to use inflates demand for road usage.
We're not saying in this video that it's wrong to have rules about housing for aesthetic, historic, or environmental reasons. We are saying that we need to pay attention to whether these rules are restrictive enough that less housing gets built, because housing supply really does matter. Limiting housing supply has real consequences for people. At the extreme end, this means more homelessness, which has been linked to low supply and high prices. But the effects of a housing crisis go so much deeper than that. A housing crisis means enduring long commutes, living in overcrowded or inadequate housing, not being able to move out of your parents' house, getting priced out of the city you grew up in, or making it harder to start a family. Building enough housing does not solve all social problems, but having a housing shortage makes a lot of problems worse.
Throughout this video, we've assumed that new housing supply will be privately built and market rate, because realistically speaking, that's how most housing gets built. That's obviously not the only type of housing possible. There's also public or social housing and housing co-ops. We actually spent part of our time in Toronto living in a co-op built in the 1980s with federal funding that offered subsidized rent to some low-income tenants and non-subsidized but still below market rent to the rest. It was a good experience, and we think cities would be better off if more people had the option for this kind of housing. Importantly, though, many of the same roadblocks to market rate housing, like zoning and community opposition, also make it hard to build public and co-op housing. From where we stand, there's just no way out of the housing affordability crisis that doesn't involve making it easier to build more housing.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to liberalize housing regulations and subscribe.